Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Dibb, and I am completely honored to be here with Dr. Roland Griffiths. Roland is a longtime meditator, a pharmacologist, a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he is the founding director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. And he has been spending a long time in his life researching the clinical effects of psychedelics, including their impact on those struggling with cancer and depression and addiction. And Roland also has another part of his inner and outer journey, which has included a pretty deep dive into breath work, which is, like psychedelics, quite an upcoming topic of conversation in terms of consciousness. And so we are here to delve into many topics that have to do with integrated awakening. Roland, I'm really honored that you're here.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I'm delighted to join you.
So Roland, as I was thinking about this conversation, I felt like you are one of those people in my life that I can count on, that every time we encounter each other, we are in the midst of the perennial conversation. From the moment that we met, the topic was awakening. In fact, we met in a class called Awakening, and I feel like everything we ever talk about, whether it is science or consciousness or breath work or meditation or research or psychedelics or family members, is all about that service to awakening. And that is a deep joy in my life to be in that conversation with you.
Well, I can't think of anything more important to me and what I view as a vision for humanity than what we euphemistically call awakening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and vis-a-vis that, I know that you are in the process of creating a project, in a sense, for studying spirituality and awakening. Do you want to say a little bit more about that and why you're doing that?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. This project actually is prompted by the fact that I received a diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis, stage 4, a little over a year ago, and started reflecting as I redid my will on the charitable contribution end of the will. What is it that I want to give? And as I thought deeply about that, I don't have a large estate. I don't have a lot of financial resources to give. But as I thought about it, what I really felt a calling to want to give is precisely what we're talking about today. And that is, I want for myself and for others to awaken to this mystery in which we find ourselves. And as a scientist who had a midlife awakening, and we can talk about that, but that was what brought me into being interested in the study of psychedelics, and because they're very powerful opportunities to create awakening experiences, and so the vision was to create an endowment for a research program that would continue in perpetuity, that is forever, or as long as Johns Hopkins, that's my home institution, continues to exist, that would focus on rigorous empirical research on psychedelics, for for the service of furthering our understanding about spirituality and well-being in the service of human flourishing very, very broadly. And so what I'm bringing here is my toolkit as a scientist for trying to understand reality as it can be unfolded through the scientific process. And it turns out that psychedelics are a uniquely good and powerful experimental tool to study such awakening experiences because they can be studied prospectively. That is, we can occasion these experiences at very high probability in most people, and then study them thereafter. And that's necessary for research to work. We need something that we can, some manipulation we can do that produces such as experiences, and then we can randomize different groups to receive that. And all of the tools of science are open to it. It can be studied at the basic brain network, biological level, but it can be just studied at psychological level, and the enduring consequences of these experiences. So that's the endowment of created, and I'm very excited about it. But exactly to the point that we're sitting here talking today, it's completely about the experience of awakening, how we can come to know and understand that better and better. And then the larger thought of that is that awakening process, through that, we recognize that we're really all in this together. There's there's no difference among us. And that has huge ethical, pro-social implications. And ultimately, my view is that it's going to be critical to the survival of our species to get our core ethical, moral principles ironed out and worked out. And I think the gateway into that is understanding the awakening process.
Well, awakening, like love, it could be talked, there's so many different doorways we could go into exploring it. And I'm thinking about the fact that I've had the privilege of being present at many, many births and also many, many deaths. And some of those deaths have been extremely personal. Very close people to me, my immediate family. And I've noticed, first of all, that the experience of the energetic in the room is very similar in birth and death. And we might say that the veil that is between us and the formlessness of life is removed for a little while, and we can feel both when someone's coming in, the soul is coming into the planet, how much they deserve everything. They deserve all the love, all of the nurturance, all of the resources that they need to flower. And when someone leaves, oftentimes we realize how sacred each moment was. And I've certainly watched people get all the way to the end of their life before they suddenly realize, what was I doing with so many of those moments? I wasn't really awake. And I think what we're talking about is how your endowment in that project could serve people being able to access awakening as they're living, not needing a catastrophic event or death or something that catapults them in it, but how can we really access that moment by moment? And I even want to say, as you can imagine, breath by breath.
Yeah, of course. And let me clarify. The endowment is focused on psychedelic research, but that's only a means to an end experimentally. There are, of course, numerous ways to awaken, and breath work is among the more powerful of those. But meditation, embodied awareness practices, birth and death, and all kinds of different transitional states, all can lead to awakening. The reason the endowment focuses on psychedelics is only because they're a useful tool, but they're in the service of understanding this process that we're calling awakening. And that is the important thing. And that's what we should, in my view, be most interested in personally, is how do we awake and stay awake?
So there's some really deep inquiries there, Roland, because my experience, to the extent that we feel afraid, to the extent that we feel cut off from the source, to the extent even that we've incurred, trauma in our lives, or we've had attachment with caregivers earlier in our life that have not been optimal, our temperament will tend to kind of grab onto things that fill us, that make us feel more whole. But there's always a danger of reifying that, like that's the new identity, so to speak. And what you're talking about right now is like, really, what would it be to be freed up from that kind of grasping onto anything, grasping onto the effects of breath work, grasping onto the effects of psychedelics, grasping onto the effects of meditation, to really awaken to what our deepest potential is.
That's exactly it, Jessica. And I recall vividly the first time I met you, and it was in this class you teach in awakening. And you posed the question to everybody, what brings you here? What is it that you want? And at that juncture in my life, I had already spent certainly more than a decade, a couple decades, in meditation, which is kind of focusing on an introverted experience of awakening. But what I expressed is my desire to stay awake moment to moment. And indeed, you have a whole different way, a whole set of ways of encouraging embodied awakening. That is off the cushion. It gets you to the same place. Breath work gets you to the same place. Psychedelics is, I think, less so in terms of a moment-to-moment embodied awakening. But that's exactly what it's about. How do we stay awake? And I guess what I have come to totally understand, and I certainly can't hold myself out as being enlightened or being able to hold continuous awakening, but I totally get the fact that it's there every moment that we want to lean into it, no matter what circumstances we're in. There's this larger field that we can step back into, and it has all of the beauty and depth and profundity of the core mystery of awakening.
It's so beautiful to hear you express that, Roland, because here you have a supposedly terminal, diagnosis. and I always say supposedly because, right, anything is possible, and that is actually really true.
Yes.
When my sister was diagnosed with metastatic stage 4 breast cancer in 1992, we were just at the crest of understanding that there was an epidemic of breast cancer, and we didn't know everything we know now. And so, that really, although her life was extended significantly from what was predicted due to things like meditation, breath work, inner work and all of that. Now there are people who have her same diagnosis that have, they're just alive 20 and 30 years later. We've learned how to kind of keep extending treatment. So, that's why I say supposed. And but for many people, that would be a really frightening experience. It would make them want to, understandably, cause them to contract, pull in their resources, go into a little bit of survival mode, have a lot of anxiety. And yet here you are with a smile on your face, talking about awakening in very luminous terms. So can you say something for that, what has been the case for you about the intersection between realizing the ephemeral nature of each moment and the mortality that means, for human beings, and the potential for awakening in each moment, each breath?
Yeah. So, yeah, my experience with the diagnosis has been, frankly, a delightful surprise to me. So I got the diagnosis over a year ago. And initially, it was just a routine screening colonoscopy. And I thought myself to be completely healthy at the time. So it really came out of nowhere to me. And it was a kind of a puzzling shock. Initially, it felt like it just couldn't be true. It felt like this has to be some kind of bad dream from which I'm going to awaken. But then very quickly, I started sorting through the different psychological states that might come up with such a diagnosis. And so, of course, despair and depression and anxiety, anger, choosing to fight the cancer, resentment at the medical system that didn't protect me as much as I perhaps should have been protected by going more often for colonoscopy screenings. So there are any number of psychological positions one could inhabit that would be nothing but difficulty, as I saw it. It'd just be very unpleasant to inhabit any of those states. And as I reflected and I reflected on my own meditation and spiritual practices over the decades, I recognized the very power of gratitude for the preciousness of this human life. And of course, that's something that on the spiritual path we often contemplate, but this came in with vividness to me at the time of diagnosis that was just unmistakable. And so I set as an intention to practice gratitude, that gratitude would be my go-to practice. And that's exactly what's happened for me. Whatever emotional state might start to arise, and being treated in the medical system for an illness of this sort raises all kinds of opportunities to be challenged, be it, surgery or chemotherapy or other interventions that on one level could be very uncomfortable. and but on another level, and I think this is part of what we learn when we come to learn the nature of mind, is at that other level, those experiences can be deconstructed into energy, right? I mean, it's so fear or anxiety, if you really go into them at their core and contemplate them, you realize, one, they're not stable things. They're a label that you put on. And two, they can be deconstructed into pure energy, and that can be the energy of awakening. It can be the energy of gratitude. And so for reasons I don't understand, because I wouldn't have anticipated that this would have been the course of it, I've been able to turn that emergent energy into just a contemplation of gratitude. And so I find myself, much wider awake, with more gratitude and love and equipoise than any time before in my life, which is unexpected, but it's been joyful. And my wife Marla and I consider the diagnosis now to have been a blessing, because this has just been an incredible year that I've had, with so many blessings, that have poured out of that. It's that I've lost my track.
I'll come in and ask a question. How about that?
Yeah,
We'll just
let's see where was that unfolding toward? I lost it.
Well, you were saying about Marla and you have
Yeah.
considered this year a great blessing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, you had asked how this had come to be. Yeah. Okay. Well, wait, let me just pick up a little bit on that.
Okay.
So if I reflect on then how it is that this last year has been so marvelous, I think I would credit it principally to the spiritual practices of things like meditation and breath work and embodied awareness practice, being mindful of what's going on in my mind at any given point, and choosing in what direction to lean into those experiences. So it's all about the sense of presence in the context of this miracle that we find ourselves in. And I would say, because I've done a lot of work with psychedelics also has played a role in that, but just a role within a much larger context of this project of awakening. But in a nutshell, what happened was at the time of the diagnosis, I considered myself to be reasonably awake. I've been practicing a long time. And what happened was just big stage jump. I mean, the extent to which I was awake, now it looks like I was a little bit groggy there. And I'm not, and there's still a flow of that. But the inspiration it provides me is the understanding that I could have gone in principle without the diagnosis, much more fully toward awakening. And ultimately, that's what I want for everyone. I want people to awaken, in absence of having a terminal diagnosis or being on their deathbed. And I think in principle, that certainly has to be the case. I mean, this is what you teach. What's your reflections on that, Jessica?
Well, first of all, it's very moving that you're having this experience, Roland, and that you're so generously sharing it, with the world. And I think it is poignant for you to share that to some degree you had tilled the soil, you had tilled the garden to be able to receive the seeds of this gratitude and this awakening and this understanding, because I do think that is the purpose of spiritual practice. Again, it's not to develop an identity, but it is to develop a vehicle for consciousness itself, for awakening, for us to be able to be both a capacitor and a receiver for it. So I just want to honor, your lifelong turning towards that impulse. I mean, how many of the time-honored spiritual teachers down through the ages have said the purpose of our life is to remember who we really are. It's to awaken to who we really are. And I know the story of my sister who, about a little bit of time before she actually did pass, she kind of went into a coma for a number of hours. And when she emerged, she shared. Now, you have to remember, this was a woman that had been doing Jungian dream therapy, doing meditation, doing yoga, doing breath work, doing classes that I taught and other people. She even was taking a class at seminary, the seminary school. She was not a lazy person in terms of all this. But I will never forget that when she woke up out of that coma, which we had not necessarily expected her to wake up out of, to live for some more time, she said, all of my life, the teachings have been swirling around inside of me. And I'm just realizing that it really is like the Eightfold of path of yoga. We are meant to love every moment, to give love every moment, and we are meant to grow and do nothing but grow every single moment. And then she said, and I've been lazy, but now I'm not going to be anymore. So she had that similar experience to what you're describing, Roland, is that she had tilled the ground, the soil, for a long time, but there came this other level of waking up at that moment. And then it literally was like every moment was devoted to awakening, remembering, loving. And it's just really, it's kind of humbling and an honor to be in your presence, as that is what you are experiencing. And also want to reflect with what you said, that it was a beautiful expression about not getting caught up in the identity of awakening, like being a yogi, or even just that thing that we can get into inside of ourselves of like, well, now I've got it together because I'm doing practice, or whatever way that our fear gets soothed by these things, because you likened it to energy, that everything is energy. The fear is energy. The practice is energy. The question is, can we get so present to the energy itself that we can devote it, be devoted to the energy of awakening and of love, kind of to be really, to craft it, to disciple ourselves to it, to surrender ourselves to it. And I think that's what your research, and particularly this new endowment and the orientation that we're talking about with practices of meditation and breath work and embodied awakening and psychedelics, that's what we really want to be after. Is how do we get on the pulse of that energy that is the life force and let it become our teacher, because it will awaken us, because it is awakening in consciousness itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Let's see. Yeah, I actually have, let's see. Yeah. One thought about psychedelics, and then want to return to kind of, I don't know, a larger question about what this path is about. Is it, psychedelics are an unusual tool because they can so acutely, under appropriate conditions, create these awakening experiences. However, they're not particularly useful for maintaining that state. The very nature of them is so unique and contrived in one sense that it almost, it provides, and this certainly happened among many spiritual teachers of the 50s and 60s that had a psychedelic experience, went off to Southeast Asia and went deeply into spiritual practices, and then brought that back. So it's a useful tool. It's a great experimental tool, but it's certainly not a way to create an enduring awakened state. But so now let me just run something by you and then have a question for you about it. I think one of the principal things that I came to learn from initially from meditation, but I want to bring this back to breath work, is that as one sits with their mind focusing, and there are thousands of different forms of meditation, but I think the value of them is that you end up being present, watching the nature of your mind, and ultimately recognizing that you are not that voice in your head. It's a de-identification with a basic identity that in our culture, that's all many people know of themselves, as what their name, their occupation, their roles that they inhabit, and they're so identified with those that they're losing the context of the larger the larger miracle that we find ourselves in. And so through a number of these kinds of spiritual practices, I think for me, principally, I've come to de-identify with that. And you start de-identifying with personality, and then flowing from that comes de-identifying from emotions as well. And that's what I was talking about, deconstructing emotions. But it does take enduring practice. Now, the question I have about breath work is that my experience of breath work, when I finally got it, and I did so through you and one of the teachers that you so skillfully taught, with whom I worked on a one-to-one basis, and breath work can be a very powerful opening experience, but it does require falling into the kind of the larger sense of what's going on. And initially, I think I found myself in just watching other people practice breath work people can easily get identified with somatic events that are coming in, and then their entire focus becomes on the, their stomach, or a pain in the shoulder, or something of that sort. And I think somehow I short-circuited some of that, or no, in fact, I went through that, and it took me a number of sessions before I kind of opened up and kind of got it. And then it was almost like magic then. All of that somatic stuff dropped away. The work element of breathing and concentrating on breathing, fell away. And it just very quickly opens me into a non-dual state, that's absolutely magnificent, has all the qualities of the awakened mind. So that I'm just curious about your reflections of that. Do people go through a learning process with breathwork of the type that I'm describing? Because I'm thinking of the parallel in meditation. It's a very rare individual who goes to their first meditation retreat and comes out awakened. Much more often than not, they're wrestling with their mind, their identity. They can go through all kinds of nasty things before they can see the background, the forest for the trees, if you will. So I'd love to hear your reflections with respect to breath work.
Well, thank you for that. What I consider to be one of the salient questions of our time in terms of both breath work as a modality and a medium for consciousness and awakening, and just the whole exploration of awakening itself. This to me is literally one of the top, 2 or 3 salient questions. Because again, who is the one, if we get really esoteric here, who is the one who is doing the meditation? Who is the one that's doing the breath work? Who is the one that's taking the psychedelics? And as long as you're kind of seated in that there's an I that is doing this, whatever it is, you're going to still, to some degree, get some distortion and not be in the center of just true awakening. Now, that doesn't mean that we're just going for, what might be called neti, nothingness, emptiness. I mean, that's powerful and true and all of that. But if we say, okay, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, but there is something that I am, or that everything is. And I think that, to me, is one of the most potent things that breath work as a medium might bring to this table, might bring to the whole topic of awakening. Is, so I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, but I am. But to not be in the separated self, I am breathing. And I mean that both like the recognition of the verb that's going on, but more like Coleman Barks's translation of one of Rumi's poems called Only Breath, where he says, I'm paraphrasing, but not Sufi, not Zen, not Muslim, not Christian, not Hindu, not Buddhist, not any religion, not from down in the ground or from up in the sky, not from any place, not from any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless. I have seen the 2 worlds as one, and that one call to and know as first, last, outer, inner, breath, breathing human being. So we can sit, we can meditate, we can have breakthrough experiences into altered states, as you're describing can happen with psychedelics and certainly all of these other modalities too. And if if an individual or humanity is to take a leap into what you've referred to as embodied awakening, we have to actually be able to be in the verb of living of what is here. And I think breath is not only something that is an energy flow. It's not like a static noun. It's not a state. It's a flow that is experienced every moment, but it's also something that we share collectively. Every single person on the planet is breathing. And so you can't go into distinctions of like, gender and skin color and religion and socioeconomic status. You can't create in-group and out-group. There's only one group of breathers. There's literally only one group. And so, the implications here are astounding. Now, I think when we're first coming to breath work and we're coming from separation consciousness, if you will, then all of the things that you describe happen. And then I think there's another stage, where's this really salient question that you're asking, which is how are breathwork facilitators approaching breathwork? Are they themselves, I would want to say, still caught up in the model of breathwork that's about the phenomenon of it, catharsis, emotional feelings and the somatic, the somatic sort of perturbations and manifestations that happen, all of which are good in the sense that they free us up initially. They free us up to see the parts of ourselves somatically, emotionally, cognitively that we weren't aware of. In a sense, they're great for opening up what, Carl Jung would call the shadow. And we can get enraptured and or fixated or fascinated by that phenomenon, when the real thing that's trying to happen is to remember ourselves as breathing, remember ourselves as literally an emanation of the creative life force in every breath. And so one small thing that I like to say, but the orientation is just incredible, is that we shouldn't be breathing into the phenomenon that arises. We should be inviting the phenomenon to breathe. Like, okay, pain in my knee. Not like, okay, breathe in, try to fix you, something's wrong with you. It's kind of like you, Roland, you're not trying exactly to fix the cancer. I mean, you're happy but what you're trying to do is be alive. And look what's happening. Look how, radiant you are at this moment. And so it's like, don't try to fix the knee. Give the knee permission to breathe. Let the intelligence of the knee and the pain in the knee figure out its own thing. So I think the whole sort of question of how, there's no doubt that breath work puts us into these extraordinary phenomenon and breakthrough experiences and non-ordinary states of consciousness. And to embody them in every moment takes another level of understanding what we're really after here. And this is maybe even beyond the scope of our conversation, but for me, that's why a big part of my work right now is developing training standards and ethics for breath workers to have a level of training that is about consciousness, that is about awakening, and not to get kind of a reification of what breath work should be about. So I don't know if that's an answer to exactly what you were asking, but I hope it helped.
So let me run some ideas that are just flowing through right now to you about some similarities between meditation, breath work, and psychedelics. So with meditation, of course, there are all kinds of different meditation traditions. Some of them put in forefront emergent experiences as being the most important value of the meditation. Whereas other traditions do just the opposite. They say ignore these emergent experiences, and Buddhism in particular, Zen, really pushes not to attach to whatever it is you think, particularly if you think you've learned something of value, because you don't want to get attached and identified with that, which is, I think, exactly the point you were making with breath work, that someone can become attached to the emergent experiences. But I've found that the value, and then with psychedelics, and certainly some of the psychedelics that have vivid effects on the visual plane, emergent of visual experiences, it's very easy for people to get attached to those and then wrap a whole set of meaning around, that visual experience. And there are insights that can occur both in meditation and from breath work and from psychedelics with respect to these emergent experiences. But I think the point you were making, and it's true of both meditation and psychedelics, is that's fine, that's interesting, but it's not the heart of what one might take out of this, because that background sense of the awakened mind is really kind of the underlying gold, for as I see it, of these practices, and all can be cultivated within these different kinds of practices. But then it's bringing them out of either sitting on the cushion or doing the breathwork session or taking the psychedelic into moment-to-moment life that is really where we're going with this.
Mhm. Yeah, that was beautifully laid out, what you said, Roland, and that really is the thing. So for me, this is why breath work has become central, I think, to the awakening of consciousness on our planet, because first of all, everyone can do it. It's accessible to everyone. It's like the ultimate democratic, medium. It is literally the beginning and the end of this life. And it is a verb, like it's you breathe during the session, and then you keep breathing after the session. You breathe during the practice, but you keep breathing after the practice, which is different than meditation or psychedelics, for instance. So I think the promise there, even though, of course, we would say that there's walking meditation, there's mindfulness with everything you do, but that you have we have a biological mechanism that is likely also like the doorway to consciousness, and it's going on every moment, just seems to me filled with promise for being a universal medium for everybody for embodied awakening.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yes. Yeah. No. I agree. That does totally resonate with me.
But I know that in the psychedelic, well, first of all, Roland, there's something I've been wanting to say since we began, just because it's so beautiful for people to know, and probably many who are tuned in do, but in many ways, you are the guy that is responsible for the fact that psychedelics has had the resurgence that it has, and is having the efficacy that it's having with regards to, people with trauma and addiction and depression and all of these things. Because I like to think of, like, this is just such a human little story, that you were at Johns Hopkins, a place that I usually consider to be quite conservative academically and medically, and yet one of the greatest institutions on the planet for research. you found these files in a sense that had been locked away from the, the 60s and 70s where research had initially been taking place. And, you had the curiosity, but I also want to say the courage to kind of pull them out and go through the conservative channels, of Hopkins and get them to sign off on beginning to study these things. So, really thank you so much for the intelligence and courage that took.
Well, and again, to precisely what we're talking about, what got me curious about psychedelics was the kind of opening experiences I initially had in meditation, and then a curiosity about that sort of investigation that up until the point that midlife that I started the meditation practice, up until that point, I was not internally reflective and appreciative of the wonder that emerges from that. And so I initially got involved with meditation. It opened up this window of curiosity for me that was just, it was brand new. I just knew very little about, and I wouldn't have considered myself spiritual. I certainly was not religious, but there was something there. There was a there that had been elusive, and made me deeply curious about this internal investigation. And so it was that then, because I was trained as a psychopharmacologist, I was well established. Had an international reputation, full professor in the departments of psychiatry and neuroscience for the work I had done studying drugs, that I became intrigued with putting the lens of science into psychedelics to see if they had anything to say about these kinds of experiences. And indeed they do. And so that's been the course of my research for the last more than 20 years. But you're right, at the time the time I first thought about doing that study, no study had been approved for decades that allowed the administration of a high dose of a psychedelic to a psychedelic naive individual. And so it was considered a third rail, and academically, it wasn't clear that we could get approval of that sort of study. But it was raw curiosity on my part, because I was deeply interested what that had to say in the tools of science. And frankly, at the point that I would say I started to awaken, the kind of stuff I was doing in psychopharmacology became relatively uninteresting to me. And I really questioned about if that was my life course. And I deeply contemplated seriously going off to India and living in an ashram and going deeply into meditation. And, and as it turns out, this has just been a wonderful outcome, because studying psychedelics is right in line with what I'm most interested in. And that's this process of personal awakening. And so to be able to bring the tools of science to that has been nothing but a remarkable gift for me. And I feel very fortunate to have done that. But, my parallel life course has been to deepen my own practice. And that's where I ultimately found you as a very skillful teacher for embodied awareness practices and breath work. So there's been a great convergence of that.
Well, it is a great convergence. And, as somebody who did live in India in an ashram for 6 months when I was younger, and would never trade that experience for anything. No, it absolutely was an initiation into so many things that live in me every moment. Nevertheless, it became very apparent to me that is kind of like the visit into psychedelics, or meditation or breath work when it's being used only for breakthrough kinds of experiences. I just became so aware that the call of our times is how we are going to live this stuff in an everyday, ordinary way, because that's where we're messing up. It's the way we're living our everyday, ordinary lives is polluting and destroying and causing increase in, medical problems and health problems. And so it's right there that we need to be present with this, may I call it quantum level consciousness, or just some consciousness of awakening that has access to a kind of intelligence and healing force that would not otherwise be possible. So I am so glad that you decided to go the route that you did, because this is extraordinary, Roland, for an institution with the caliber of Hopkins, who's as rigorous and conservative as Hopkins is, to be having this, the psychedelic center and consciousness center, and then for you to be now creating this next level exploration into consciousness and awakening it's right where we need to be. It needs to be on the streets, So
Totally agree.
I'm wondering if we might, we have talked a little bit about how all of these modalities can be used in a way that actually reifies identity, and it actually in a way perpetuates the separate consciousness that each of us has, which, as Einstein said, it was an optical delusion, and of course it's very dangerous for our planet. We've talked about how there needs to be this transformation where we are devoting all of that for the process of awakening and moving into these new levels of consciousness. And I also touched upon the fact that I feel like breath workers need to have a really next generation kind of training, easily, may I say, just this is my own sense of it, easily as rigorous as, a mental health professional, even a psychiatrist, but with the understanding, the shamanic understandings of those levels of consciousness. And I feel like there's an ethical responsibility almost there, because these things can be misused, boundaries can get crossed, people can be hurt. In a sense, something that it has such vast potential can be used for a sort of, good, but maybe a lesser possibility. And I wonder what you see in the psychedelic community in terms of, well-trained facilitators and ethical understanding, because, there's probably almost nothing that opens up those boundaries as explosively often as psychedelics.
Yeah. Well, boy, with the huge unfolding interest across our culture in psychedelics, I actually have come to worry about whether the people offering this service are going to be sufficiently well trained, both to protect, so that there are downside risks to all of these practices, and meditation is not without its risk. I'm guessing breath work is as well, and certainly psychedelics. I think probably psychedelics are the most risky of these kinds of interventions because they really can go wrong, and people can become enduringly psychotic or have reactions that are that result in subsequent mood problems. A year more later, they'll continue to report problems from difficult experiences. Not to mention with psychedelics that people end up getting confused or disoriented or panicked and engage in dangerous behavior that can be life-threatening. So there are plenty of risks attached to the psychedelics, and those are greater than breath work and meditation. But nonetheless, all of these opening experiences do have these kinds of downside risks. I'm particularly concerned with the zeal with which the proponents and the enthusiasts of psychedelic use are moving forward with legalization and decriminalization campaigns that are going to make they are going to lower the bar very substantially to therapists credentialing. And there's a risk therein. And I think that's what you're reflecting on with respect to breath work. There's an array of practitioner skills. Now, it's even a little bit more complex with psychedelics because they're on the road for approval as medicines for treatment of very specific disorders. And they appear to have promise preliminarily for things like depression and maybe certainly end-of-life existential anxiety, depression, maybe eating disorders, and the addictions. And to the extent that they are medically helpful, they need not be held in this kind of larger sense of the awakening process. But in fact, I think that some of the core mechanisms of their therapeutic effects relate to, but don't completely overlap with what we're talking about in terms of awakening. And right now with psychedelics, we don't have any approvable cultural model that will allow administration of psychedelics for the purpose of awakening. Whereas the beauty of breath work and meditation is that they don't have those kind of constraints on top of them. Just another reflection about kind of downside risks of the people offering these therapies, and that is they themselves can get into very toxic areas of ego inflation. And certainly in the meditation world, we've seen it time and time again with gurus and other leaders within certain traditions that end up exploiting their followers, and I think that's part of the human condition. They've become so enthralled with their capacity that they have stepped over an ethical line and ended up perhaps inadvertently abusing people. That certainly can be the case with practitioners or therapists using psychedelics. People can get, ego inflation, that they have some gift to offer people, that they're uniquely well qualified in terms of using these gifts, and then that becomes a problem. And I'm guessing, but you would know much better than I, the same risk would be true of breathwork practitioners, albeit much less.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate everything you're saying, Roland, and I like the phrase lowering the bar. I want to come back to that in just a moment. I really think that with breath work, see, it's all of these things, there's an intoxicating quality that can go with all of them. And again, I remember Carl Jung talked about the fact that in many ways, addiction was a thirst. It was like it was the thirst for the spirit. It was the thirst for that level of intoxication. But you were lowering the bar. He didn't say that, but you were getting it from this grosser substance, so to speak, rather than, what the real thirst is. And so I think that with breath work, it's very tantalizing, because it is free and it is accessible to anybody. And all you have to do is lay somebody down and have them breathe in a certain manner for a few minutes. And there's usually some effect that is noticeable, and in many cases is euphoric, or at least a breakthrough, or the crying that didn't happen for your, father that died, 40 years ago, or whatever it may be. And so I think that there's this generation, or not generation, but there's this sector of the breathwork community that feels like, well, this should be free. Since it is free, we should see that anybody can do it, and breath is the teacher, and all of those things are true. But we don't raise our children like that. We don't garden like that. We don't take care of our body that way. And we need to learn how to receive the sacred medicine of meditation, of psychedelics, and certainly of breath, which I would argue is our most powerful and immediate medicine and healer on the planet. We need to do right by it. And so I do think that it then depends on what's the orientation that the breath worker is coming from, and what's the training that they got. What is the ethical training? What are the theoretical and experiential training? And I don't think we should be, brings me back to lowering the bar. I don't think we should be shy or lazy, as my sister said about herself, or put off by the fact that a facilitator of plant medicine, a facilitator of psychedelics, a facilitator of meditation, and certainly a facilitator of breath work, the bar should be very high. We're talking about energy, to use a metaphor that may be literal. We're talking about energy and a medicine of the gods, in all of these circumstances. So we should have the highest bar for somebody who is considering themselves to be a facilitator. That is my personal feeling.
I agree. And so that's one of the puzzlements that's occurring within psychedelics, because they're being developed, at least initially, for medical use. They're falling under the domain of medicine. And one of the peculiar outcomes of that, from where I sit, is that as the Food and Drug Administration has gotten more and more involved in this, and they do have interest, they do recognize its potential therapeutic process, but they're grasping for how to credential people. And ironically enough, they will allow, for instance, virtually any psychiatrist that have any training in psychotherapy to administer psychedelic. And and having worked with these compounds for more than 20 years. And I know an awful lot of psychiatrists, most of whom I wouldn't let near one of our participants, because training as a psychiatrist does not allow you to comport yourself professionally or even understand the domains of what it takes to support a psychedelic session. So in this case, FDA thinks they're raising the bar, and I see it as, in a very risky way, lowering the bar very significantly. But I think that's really what you're pointing to. We both have a sense that there's a deep skill set involved for the therapist in delivering these interventions, and certainly part of it with psychedelics is certainly medical, but that's only a smaller piece of what goes on, and how these interventions can be used most consequentially. And ethics certainly is a key question there. And it's bafflingly complex to me, to be frank. But I also, what I've said about psychedelics, and I think it's also true of meditation and breath work, is that we just cannot unleash, or we shouldn't. It would be foolish to unleash psychedelics on the culture at scale with under poor training conditions, and unless we want to recapitulate the 1960s, where everything went crazy and resulted in shutting down the psychedelic enterprise altogether. What occurs to me is that we actually have to develop the cultural institutions around the practice of these, so that we can use psychedelics wisely. And I would argue that the same is true of breath work and of meditation, although they don't have some of the immediate downside risks. It's still, we need to puzzle out, how to introduce these most effectively and most wisely into culture to produce maximum effects. And that sounds to be exactly what you're focusing in on.
Thank you so much, Roland. I am completely aligned with you. I have the same sense that the professions that we're talking about, the facilitators of these, highly energetic, non-ordinary states of consciousness, potentials, are training that are going to have to be interdisciplinary. It won't be enough to be just a psychotherapist, or just a breath worker, or just a spiritual director, or just a shaman. It's almost like you're going to have to, or even a philosopher. At this point, I actually knows a whole group of breath workers that are like, they're originally philosophers, significant philosophers, and they're developing a whole new ontology about how we look at life through from within the atmosphere of breathing. So I think that what I'm thinking is that from within the culture of psychedelics, and from within the culture of meditation and breath work, the people who see these things anyway need to kind of come together and literally discern and cultivate and express and articulate what the training could and should entail. And, it is partially, of course, for safety. And then it is partially for efficacy of the particular things that somebody might be engaging in those modalities for. And even more than that, it's so that we can tap into the deepest potential for each of those things. What's the deepest where can psychedelics take us? Where can breath work take us? Where can meditation take us? And you just need, facilitators who, I think of Jung, how he said that a person, well, first of all, Viktor Frankl said that a person who wants to be able to carry light must be able to endure burning. And I think there is an initiation to be a facilitator of this level. And I'm also thinking of Jung saying that for wholeness, one must be able to both wrestle with the devil and walk with God. And so I think that the level of training kind of needs to reflect, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate that you feel this way after all that you've observed. And I know you've seen phenomenal, miraculous things happen in psychedelic sessions or as a result of psychedelic sessions. And I know that you also have considerable experience with meditation. And then you have the way that breath work and the embodied practices have been able to usher you into the sense that it can be happening. So thank you. And kind of as we're culminating here, I'm wondering if if you were talking to people, you are talking to people, and you were to say, kind of like a message for everybody, like what really matters, and how then should we be, as Mary Oliver says in her quite famous poem, what should we be doing with our one wild and precious life? I like to say, what should we be doing with our one wild and precious breath? I mean, I'm just so appreciative of all the vectors that have gone to where you are, Roland, and that you're literally sitting on this precipice of life and death and the sacredness of each moment.
So the question is, what message do I have?
Yeah. What do you want us all to know?
Yeah.
Where you're sitting.
Let's see, Jessica, it's precisely what we're talking about. It just seems to me that the absolutely most precious and valuable thing that we can do is to awaken with gratitude to the mystery in which we find ourselves. So, if we just, sit back and reflect on where we are. So we're these highly evolved creatures walking the earth. We can see things, we can feel things, we can smell things, taste things. We can move about the environment. We can manipulate things with our hands. As a species, we've developed language and culture. We've developed a scientific method, and we've learned a lot about what's going on. But most astonishing of all to me is the fact that as these creatures roaming the earth, we can reflect on the fact that we are aware that we are aware. And it's like, that's kind of the waking up. It's like, wait a second, where do we find ourselves? And it's this, we're in the middle of what can only be described as a deep mystery, if not a miracle. And what's really interesting from where I sit as a pretty hard-nosed scientist is we don't have a clue about really what's going on here, and much less awareness and consciousness. There is this question of the hard problem of consciousness, and that question boils down to how can you even imagine a solution that would emerge out of a reductionistic framework of scientists that can account for and explain interior experience. And it's a deep, deep problem scientifically, philosophically. We don't have a coherent physics that explains what's going on here. So the contemplation is to awaken to the fact that we're in this incredible mystery. When we look around, the world is a absolutely beautiful place, and it's true of everything. Even though some people would look at dog droppings as being somehow disgusting, they're not. they're not. They're as miraculous as anything else. And so that's it. That's what this awakening process is just to sit back and in wonder of the astonishment of what we're doing here. And with that astonishment should flow, at least for me, and I can't see how it's avoidable if you really lean into it, nothing but gratitude for the preciousness of this. And then what flows out of that is this sense that we're all in this together. We're all sitting in the same dilemma, if you will, the existential dilemma, that the only thing we actually know for sure is that we are aware, and we know that only for ourselves. I can't know that about you. And so that is the case with every sentient being that has this self-reflective quality, and that opens us up to this sense of mutual caretaking, and to see people suffering needlessly. It's just so painful, and there's such joy with the awakening process. So that's what I want. That's what I want for me and for you and for the world, to humankind, to awaken and to celebrate this very precious life.
Well, Roland, that has actually elicited one other, I hope, salient question, which is that, this mutual caring that you're talking about, this, desire to end unnecessary suffering for people. You have seen seemingly miraculous things happen through psychedelic journeys, diseases that have gone into remission, lifelong anxieties that have ceased, or, depressions that have been broken through, many things. I know not every session is like that. I'm just saying you've seen them. And you've certainly seen those kinds of miraculous things with breath work, it's breakthrough into literally unconditional love and states of well-being and connection with all things and all of that. Do you think that the more that we are able to create the mediums by which people can experience awareness of awareness, to be aware that we're aware, do you think that dissolves, in a sense, a certain amount of the normal lenses and the fears and the contractions that we have, so that it does open up potentials that we didn't know that we have?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, from the larger standpoint, suffering just seems so optional, in principle, right? It's the pain's inevitable, suffering's optional, and it's, and we are these evolved creatures with a bunch of tendencies that don't don't necessarily serve us well, because they worked well when we were primitive tribal beings, but not within our cultural context. So I think it's yes, so important to kind of to sit back and rest in that larger vision in which the anxieties and fears and the identification with the narrative structure that we have learned to speak about ourselves with can dissolve into the magnificent present moment.
Well, Roland, as always, thank you for your company. Thank you for your devotion to truth. Thank you for your life's work thus far. There's more to come, obviously. Thank you for your generosity here in this time. The world has so much to be grateful to you about, and I personally feel honored that I get to play and work with you. So thank you so much.
Well, let me just say right back at you, Jessica, you have been a very important teacher to me, and hundreds, maybe thousands of others. So keep up the good work. It feels to me like we're all of us who are seeking toward this awakening are on parallel paths, and we bring different skill sets in, and we can contribute in different ways, and I happen to, wear a scientist hat and got involved with the psychedelics. You're coming at a different angle, but we are all in this together, and it's a great privilege and honor to know you and to work with you in this larger, audacious vision.
Yes, this audacious vision. So the session is dedicated to that audacious vision for all and awakening for all. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.